Bathsheba lived in the days of King David, during a golden era for the nation of Israel, but one also marked by deep moral and spiritual crises. It was a time when the kingdom was expanding rapidly, consolidating military victories and achieving political stability under the leadership of a man after God's own heart. Yet behind the palace walls, seeds of intrigue, pride, and decisions were being sown, seeds that would threaten not only a family, but the future of an entire nation. Society was profoundly patriarchal and hierarchical. A woman's destiny was almost always tied to that of her husband or father, and marriages followed standards of honor, lineage, and political alliance. The royal court was the center of power, but it was also a place where every glance was scrutinized, secrets were buried, and the consequences of a single choice could echo for generations. Bathsheba emerged within this context, a descendant of an influential family. Her father, Eliam, was one of David's mighty warriors, men who risked their lives for the kingdom's security. Her grandfather, Ahithophel, was one of the king's most respected counselors, whose word carried weight in the halls of the throne. In other words, Bathsheba was no ordinary woman. She grew up surrounded by Israel's elite, living in constant tension between honor and scandal, between duty and desire. But in a setting where everything seemed to follow tradition, she was pushed into the center of a story no one saw coming. One day, in the quiet routine of Jerusalem, a single decision made atop a rooftop would change her life forever. How would you react if you were dragged into a crisis you didn't cause but couldn't escape either? Bathsheba's story is not just about sin and judgment. It's about how God works in the midst of human frailty, redirecting paths that seemed ruined. Her journey moves through the valley of shame but ends with the birth of a king. And through her, we learn that God's mercy is greater than our mistakes and that there is purpose even in the darkest roads we are forced to walk. The sun rose over Jerusalem, its golden light touching the stone rooftops as if to bless yet another day of peace in the city of the great king. For most, it would be just another ordinary morning. But for Bathsheba, it would mark the beginning of a journey no dream could have dared to predict. Her husband, Uriah, was away on a military campaign with the other loyal soldiers of King David. He was a man of integrity, loyal and known for his bravery. As the wife of a warrior, Bathsheba was accustomed to absence and waiting. Her days at home were filled with simple routines, tending to the household, silent prayers, and the constant hope that Uriah would return safe and sound. That afternoon, the heat grew more intense than usual. Her tired body longed for relief, and her mind sought a moment of rest. As was customary at the time, Bathsheba went up to the rooftop of her house to bathe a private and intimate moment. It was a common practice in Jerusalem, especially for women seeking privacy away from the busy streets. But she had no idea that her moment would be watched by distant and powerful eyes. From the heights of the palace, David was walking. Perhaps he was restless, perhaps avoiding the duties of the kingdom. The war was ongoing, but the king had stayed in the city, an unusual choice for a man who normally led from the front lines. And it was in this break from routine that he saw her. The sight of Bathsheba touching the water gently, bathed in the golden light of the evening, caught David's eye like a silent trap. It wasn't just physical beauty, there was an aura of serenity, of vulnerability, that stirred in him not only desire, but the sense that he could have her, as if everything were within his reach. And in truth, everything always had been. David sent someone to ask who the woman was. The answer came directly: she is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. That answer should have been enough. She was married. Her husband was at war. She came from a family of loyal servants to the kingdom. But to a heart consumed by desire, the warning wasn't sufficient. The king sent for her. And when a king gives an order, there is no room for refusal. Bathsheba was taken to the palace, perhaps not understanding why, perhaps with her heart gripped by fear of the unknown. The palace, with its quiet halls and golden echoes, had never felt so cold as it did that night. Their encounter was surrounded by gentle words and calculated glances. David knew how to seduce with his voice and with his power. For Bathsheba, the moment was a mixture of confusion and helplessness. What can one do when faced with a king who holds all the power? When what's at stake is not just honor, but survival. The biblical text is economical with details, but the silence between the lines reveals the complexity of that moment. What happened was more than an illicit encounter. It was the breaking of a covenant. David had transgressed the law of God, and Bathsheba was dragged into the center of a tragedy she did not choose. Days later, she sent a message to the palace. A short sentence, but one that exploded like thunder within the walls: "I am pregnant." The king, who might have still believed he could move forward without consequence, was now forced to deal with the aftermath of his choice. And once again, Bathsheba was at the eye of the storm. Pregnant, married to a warrior away at war, exposed to scandal and ruin. The child growing in her womb was the result of a night wrapped in silence and sin. David tried to fix the situation. He summoned Uriah back, hoping he would spend a night with his wife to cover up the child's origin. But the soldier refused. With a sense of honor that put even the king to shame, Uriah chose to sleep at the palace entrance, saying, "How can I rest while my fellow soldiers are still out on the battlefield?" It was as if justice stood before David, clothed in simplicity. Uriah had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, but his actions revealed the stark contrast between the servant's loyalty and the king's failure. With each refusal, David's desperation grew. Until, in a cold and calculated act, he wrote a letter to Joab, the commander of the army, instructing him to place Uriah at the front of the fiercest battle and then withdraw, so he would be killed. And David handed that letter to Uriah himself. This is one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. A loyal man, killed by the very king who was meant to protect him. A pregnant woman, marked by a night that could not be undone. And an entire kingdom about to feel the weight of divine justice. If you were in Bathsheba's place, how would you react as your life crumbled for something you never chose? Pain, shame, and fear flooded that woman's heart. And yet, her story does not end here. Because God did not abandon her. He does not abandon those who suffer in silence, nor those who are wounded by others' choices. From this point forward, Bathsheba's story will only grow more intense. Because even in the valley of humiliation, God was already writing a new chapter. After the silent mourning that fell over the palace, a new season began to emerge. Still wrapped in the shadow of tragedy, Bathsheba found herself facing a void that could not be filled with words alone. The loss of her child, the memories of Uriah, and the weight of choices she had never made by her own will turn every corner of the palace into a reminder of what had been taken from her. But it was in that silence that God began to restore. David drew close to Bathsheba once again. Not as the powerful king, nor as the remorseful man, but as someone who had walked beside her through deep pain. And there, among unspoken tears and knowing glances, a new relationship was born, perhaps more mature, perhaps more humble, and certainly more marked by grace than by glory. When Bathsheba became pregnant again, the palace filled with a quiet sense of expectation. It wasn't just the birth of another child. It was a chance for redemption. A gift that seemed to come directly from the hand of God. The boy was born healthy. And his name was chosen with care, Solomon, from the Hebrew root shalom, meaning peace. David loved him. But what is most impressive is that God loved him too. So much so that he sent the prophet Nathan again. This time, not with words of judgment, but with a new name for the child, Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. 2nd Book of Samuel, chapter 12, verse 25. It was as if the Lord himself was saying, even from sin, I can bring forth something I carry with my love. To Bathsheba, that name was more than an honor. It was a confirmation that her story would not be defined by sorrow alone. She dedicated herself to Solomon as a mother who knew her son carried not only her blood, but a destiny greater than any household could contain. As the boy grew, Bathsheba taught him with care. She passed on values, prayers, and memories. She knew what was happening within the court. She saw how David's older sons vied for power, forged alliances, and fueled ambition. But Bathsheba was not moved by intrigue, she was moved by promise. At the same time, David was aging. His body no longer held the vigor of youth. The king of battles was now a patriarch surrounded by family tensions. The absence of a clear heir stirred rumors and fears. Adonijah, one of the older sons, began acting as if the throne already belonged to him. He gathered allies, hosted feasts, and drew the attention of the military and religious elite. Bathsheba saw it all. And she knew that if nothing were done, she and Solomon could be swept out of the palace once David was gone. Adonijah would not hesitate. So she did what she had always done, she sought support where there was prophetic voice. She turned to Nathan. The prophet, once a messenger of judgment, now became a partner in a plan for protection and justice. He and Bathsheba coordinated their final approach to the king. It was time to remind him of the promise he had made, that Solomon would be the successor. Not just because he was the youngest son, but because he was the son of grace. Bathsheba came before David. The king, fragile, lay surrounded by servants who dared not disturb his peace. With a voice both firm and respectful, she spoke, "My lord, you swore by the Lord your God that Solomon would sit on your throne. But Adonijah has proclaimed himself king without your consent. If nothing is done, when you pass, my son and I will be treated as enemies." Then Nathan entered, confirming everything. The truth was laid bare. And David's heart, perhaps stirred by one last flame of justice and faith, was reignited. He ordered Solomon to be crowned king that very day. The scene was grand. Solomon was placed on the royal mule, the symbol of legitimate royal authority, and paraded through the streets of Jerusalem. The priests anointed him with oil, the musicians played, the people shouted. The city, once filled with uncertainty, now celebrated the rise of a new king. And it wasn't just a political victory. It was the fulfillment of a promise born from tragedy. Adonijah, upon hearing of the coronation, had his banquet interrupted by the sound of trumpets. The feast he had prepared dissolved into thin air. He realized that in trying to take by force what was not his, he had stood against the will of God. Bathsheba, now queen mother, could finally breathe. But it wasn't a sigh of vengeance, it was one of relief, gratitude, reverence. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. She had been the target of accusing stares, suffered irreversible losses, and yet, there she stood, watching her son ascend to the throne with the blessing of God. The position of Queen Mother was more than symbolic. Bathsheba became a figure of influence in Solomon's court. And the son, recognizing his mother's vital role, listened to her with respect. She advised, observed, protected. Her life, once marked by scandal, was now remembered as a bridge between a broken kingdom and a new era of wisdom and peace. Solomon, guided by the promise and the spiritual foundation he had received, sought something that few kings would ask for. When God appeared to him in a dream, offering anything he desired, he did not ask for victories, nor wealth, nor fame. He asked for wisdom to rule with justice. First Book of Kings, Chapter 3, Verse 9, and so it was that Bathsheba's son became the wisest king in Israel's history. And she, a woman long remembered only for her fall, was now remembered for her legacy. The crown now rested on Solomon's head, and the people's shouts echoed through the streets of Jerusalem, celebrating the new king. But not all acclamation is enough to silence the echoes of the intrigues that preceded the ascension. In the heart of the palace, there were still suspicious glances, veiled alliances, and interests that do not die with a ceremony. Bathsheba, now Queen Mother, knew this better than anyone. She had survived it all, the loss of her husband, public humiliation, the mourning of a child, and the threat of being forgotten. But now, at Solomon's side, she was more than a survivor, she was a guardian of the throne. Her role was not merely symbolic. As the king's mother, her presence was a living reminder that grace can turn shame into authority. However, Solomon's reign had barely begun when the shadows of past rivalries resurfaced. Adonijah, David's eldest surviving son, still believed he had a claim to the throne. He had humbled himself before Solomon after the coronation, pleading for mercy, and the new king, with wisdom and prudence, had spared his life. But within Adonijah, the desire for power still burned. That was when he devised a new plan. He used an unlikely figure to try and regain control. He asked Abiathar, the deposed priest, to help him make a request to Bathsheba. The proposal seemed simple. Adonijah wished to marry Abishag, the young woman who had served King David in his final days, caring for his aging body. At first glance, it could appear to be a romantic, almost harmless request. But Bathsheba, upon hearing the plan, immediately understood its hidden meaning. In Israel, taking one of the former king's women was a symbolic claim to the throne. It was what Absalom had done in the past, publicly usurping David's concubines. Adonijah's request was an affront masked as kindness. Bathsheba went to Solomon, as both mother and counselor. She presented the request directly, yet with the subtlety of someone who knows the dangers that lurk in the subtext of politics. The king, upon hearing it, reacted firmly. He saw that this gesture was Adonijah's last attempt to reignite the flame of rebellion. Solomon then made a harsh but necessary decision. He ordered Adonijah's execution. It was the definitive end of the threat to his authority and the beginning of a reign that would not tolerate duplicity. Justice had been served, and the promise preserved. Once again, Bathsheba witnessed the unfolding of a scheme that could have destroyed everything. But now, she was no longer a woman swept up by events. She was a woman who acted, interceded, and discerned. Her wisdom grew as the kingdom was established under her son's rule. Meanwhile, Solomon's throne was being strengthened. The young king not only consolidated his power but also ushered in a new era of peace and prosperity in Israel. His early decisions showed that he would rule with justice, inspired by the laws of the Lord and the memory of his father's mistakes. Solomon expanded alliances, organized the kingdom, and prepared the ground for the greatest of all projects, the construction of the temple. But if Solomon was the architect of the physical work, Bathsheba was the guardian of the moral one. She watched, advised, and protected the young king from the dangers that surround those in power, flatterers, foreign interests, and diverted purpose. The woman once seen only as a scandal was now becoming a model of strength and discernment. People began to look upon her with respect. The women of the court saw her as a figure of inspiration. The officials knew her words carried weight with the king. And the scribes, who recorded the deeds of the kings and their families, wrote her name with reverence: Bathsheba, mother of Solomon, queen mother of Israel. It is impossible to separate her story from her son's. And it is equally impossible to ignore how much her path was shaped by a faith that endured pain. The God of Israel, who sees in secret, never left Bathsheba on the sidelines. The woman who was once lusted after, taken by force, and marked by grief was now honored in place of her shame. The scars of the past had not disappeared. The memory of Uriah, the loss of her first son, Nathan's confrontation, all of it still lived in her recollection. But not as a prison. They lived as steps on the ladder she climbed, led by a grace the world would never understand. Bathsheba's story is, in many ways, the story of all of us. How often are we swept up by decisions we did not make? How often do we face consequences of someone else's actions? How often does pain seem to write the final chapter of our lives? But Bathsheba proves that God has the last word. And that even when all seems lost, there is still room for restoration. She fought to preserve what God had promised, and her courage was rewarded with honor, purpose, and legacy. The palace that had once been the setting of her sorrow was now her son's throne. The bed where she wept over a child's death was now the place where she rested, watching justice flourish. the name once whispered with scandal was now proclaimed with respect. Years passed, and Solomon's reign flourished like a garden watered by wisdom. The city of Jerusalem became not only the political center of Israel, but also the spiritual heart of the nation. The temple David had once dreamed of was finally built under his son's leadership, a place of glory, worship, and fulfilled promise. And behind this monumental achievement was a quiet story of faith, resilience, and redemption, the story of Bathsheba. Bathsheba was no longer seen as the woman of scandal, but as the mother of the king who brought peace to the nation. In the palace, her presence was discreet, yet her role remained strong. It was she who, behind great decisions, offered counsel, balanced tensions, and preserved purpose. She had not become a woman of the stage, but of the shadows, and it was there, in the shade of the crown, that her influence echoed most powerfully. The transformation of her image was not built on public words, but on consistent actions. In a world where reputation was everything, Bathsheba rebuilt hers stone by stone, day by day. She didn't justify herself with arguments, but with fruit. She didn't demand honor, but was honored. Her life became a living answer to the question that silently lingered: can anything good be born from a story marked by sin and tragedy? Yes. Because God does not measure men and women by human standards. He sees the heart. And Bathsheba's heart, scarred by pain and loss, was now also forged by wisdom and humility. The royal lineage of Israel continued through Solomon. And over time, the sacred records would begin to note not only the deeds of kings, but also the names of the women who shaped their paths. In the books of Chronicles, Kings, and later, in Matthew in the New Testament, Bathsheba appears as a key link in the genealogy of Jesus. Her name became part of the messianic line. This is one of the greatest proofs that God doesn't just restore, He transforms. Bathsheba, the woman whose life had been turned upside down by a decision that wasn't hers, now became part of the eternal plan of redemption for humanity. From her womb came the one who would continue David's reign, and through her descendants would come the Savior of the world. How many, looking at her in those early years, could have imagined it would be so? Who would have bet that scandal would turn into blessing? That shame would become legacy? That the woman of adultery would become the mother of the King of wisdom? That is God's signature. He writes straight with lines the world calls crooked. He takes what was broken and rebuilds it into something even more beautiful. And not just to mend the past, but to create something entirely new. The Bible does not hide the failures of its characters. And that's exactly what makes Bathsheba's story so powerful. She is human. She is fragile. She is marked by real pain. And for that reason, her journey speaks directly to everyone who has ever felt defeated, stained, forgotten, or unworthy. She teaches us that our identity is not defined by our worst moment. That our sins, even if public, are not greater than God's plan. That He can, indeed, rewrite any story and even use it to bless generations. In modern life, many people carry labels. Failure, rejected, traitor, sinner, tainted. Bathsheba carried those labels too. But in the end, what prevailed was the name God gave her, Mother of the Beloved of the Lord. She reminds us that when God intervenes, the final word is never shame. It is always grace. Solomon grew up hearing not only David's counsel, but also his mother's teachings. It was likely she who taught him to observe life with attentive eyes, to listen before judging, to value wisdom above gold. Perhaps that's why he wrote in Proverbs, chapter 31, about the virtuous woman, a portrait that echoes Bathsheba's character: strength, dignity, fear of the Lord, and a mouth that opens with wisdom. Behind the king who amazed the world with his understanding was a woman who amazed heaven with her perseverance. Bathsheba wasn't perfect. None of us are. But she was faithful to the calling she received, even when she didn't understand the path. She loved, lost, wept, rose, fought, protected, counseled, and left a legacy. And for that, her story lives on, not just in the pages of Scripture, but in the hearts of those who know God can transform any story, including ours. Bathsheba's story passed through the valley of shame, climbed the hills of perseverance, and reached the throne of promise. And when we look at all that she lived, the trauma, the loss, the humiliation, and the overcoming, it becomes clear that her journey is not about scandal, but about redemption. God did not erase her from history. On the contrary, He inscribed her into the lineage of His very own Son. And in doing so, He showed that the final word does not belong to error, pain, human judgment, or the past, but to grace, restoration, and the eternal plan of a God who transforms. Bathsheba's name appears in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, not by accident. It is there to remind us that Jesus, the Savior of the world, came through a genealogy marked by human flaws, and yet none of those flaws were enough to stop the fulfillment of the promise. Bathsheba is a symbol of a woman who was not defined by what was done to her, but by how she responded to what she endured. She did not become bitter. She did not hide. She did not let herself be reduced to the sin of others. She rose, stood firm, and built, step by step, a legacy that would last for centuries. And that leads us to an unavoidable question. Do you believe that God can transform even the hardest chapters of your life into instruments of redemption? Maybe you, like Bathsheba, have been dragged down by decisions that were not your own. Maybe you've lost something you loved, faced judgment, or carry scars the world keeps pointing out. But her story is living proof that the past does not determine the end, and that God can use even the darkest moments to create something new, beautiful, and eternal. The Christian life is not made of perfection, but of grace. It is built upon restored ruins, renewed covenants, and reawakened promises even after great failures. The cross of Christ is the greatest testimony to that, a place of death that became the ultimate symbol of life. Like Bathsheba, we are all invited to live not chained to who we were, but surrendered to what God can do in us and through us. That's why, today, you are called to take a step. If you've been carrying guilt or shame from the past, give it to God. If you've been living under the shadow of wrong decisions, let Him write a new story. If you feel your name has been marked by scandal, failure, or pain, remember that to God, your name is written into His plan, no matter how your story began. Spiritual challenge: set aside a moment this week to write in prayer the chapters of your life you want God to rewrite. Surrender them to Him. Then read Matthew, chapter 1, and see how God chose imperfect people to fulfill His perfect plan. And remember, the final word always belongs to God. And with Him, the final word is life, restoration, and hope.